Alien princess couldn't exist in daylight, so he turned Earth into night. The alien princess wasn't made for the sun. Each sunrise tore her apart, a relentless punishment that no one understood. For years they kept her hidden, buried underground, calling it mercy, but all it did was suffocate her spirit. Then one human, a man who had nothing to gain, refused to let her world end in shadow. In an act of defiance, he darkened the skies and rewrote the rules of life on Earth, giving her the chance to live. In a forgotten corner of Earth where night blanketed the landscape for months at a time, the alien princess lay cradled in a dome of darkness, her breath shallow, her skin glowing with a faint, bioluminescent hue that pulsed like a wounded star. Scientists had no name for her species, no classification for the crystalline structures in her blood, or the way her nervous system responded not to heat or light, but to cosmic silence, cold, void, and still. What they did know was this: the alien princess could not survive in daylight. Even the smallest exposure to ultraviolet rays seared her skin, set off convulsions in her alien cells, and filled the room with the acrid scent of scorched ozone. They kept her underground, away from the sun's lethal embrace, and called her a miracle, or a mistake. Most feared her, some pitied her, but only Elias dared to reach out and call her real. Elias Cade, a solar engineer turned reluctant caretaker, had been drafted into the government's bio-containment initiative not for his medical expertise, but because he'd once designed light filtration systems for long-range lunar colonization, technology now reversed, twisted into an artificial night to keep the alien princess alive. At first, Elias viewed the assignment as a scientific puzzle, a challenge to his intellect. But the first time he looked into the alien princess's eyes, vast, liquid, haunted by memories of stars he would never see, something in him broke and reassembled into a man who would move mountains for a stranger from beyond the stars. The alien princess couldn't speak, not with her mouth. Her species communicated in pulses, in the shifting colors of their irises, in electromagnetic signals that translated poorly into human comprehension. But Elias learned. He studied the rhythm of her pain, the flicker of panic when an unfiltered light beam found a crack in the shielding, the sigh of relief when the world went dark again. And he gave her a name: Lura. It meant shadow in a language his grandmother used to whisper to him during storms. The name made the alien princess blink slowly, and though she didn't understand the syllables, she seemed to accept the offering. Days turned to weeks, and as government officials cycled in and out of the base issuing cold directives, Elias quietly built a sanctuary in the dark, one that mimicked the spectrum of her homeworld's dying star. One that played symphonies composed entirely in subharmonic frequencies only the alien princess could hear. She responded. Her health stabilized. Her skin stopped blistering, and her eyes, once stormy and closed to everyone, began to follow Elias around the room, curious, alert. Still the clock ticked. Outside, political tides shifted. News of the alien princess had not yet gone public, but pressure mounted. The military wanted to relocate her to a secure orbital lab, away from Earth. The medical division wanted to extract samples that could kill her. Corporations lobbied for patents. Elias fought them all, invoking clause after clause in the Interstellar Biological Preservation Act, citing humane treatment, begging for time. He had less than a month. But Elias wasn't finished. Every night, while the alien princess rested beneath her canopy of artificial stars, Elias refined a plan he barely dared speak aloud. To give the alien princess a world she could walk in. To create darkness not just in a room, but across landscapes, ecosystems, entire cities. Project Eclipse, he called it. A network of orbital lenses and atmospheric filters, piggybacking on existing satellite infrastructure, able to dim sunlight just enough to let the alien princess live beyond the lab. Most called it madness. One senator compared it to playing God. But Elias saw the way the alien princess's fingers curled toward the imitation stars above her bed, the way her chest rose and fell when lullabies composed in ultraviolet frequencies soothed her to sleep. She deserved more than a bunker. She deserved Earth. Yet even in darkness, dangers crept in. A technician, young, curious, reckless, disregarded protocol and opened an outer chamber door without authorization. A sliver of daylight pierced the threshold. The alien princess screamed without making a sound. Her skin blistered in an instant, her limbs convulsing in violent spasms. Elias reached her first, throwing himself over her body, shielding her with his own. The burns on his back would take weeks to heal. The incident became a scandal. The technician was discharged. Elias was ordered to stand down, but the alien princess, through the haze of pain, reached for his hand and held it for the first time. Her skin was cool, trembling, and in that moment Elias knew that there would be no compromise, no half measures. Either the world would bend for the alien princess, or he would force it to. The next morning he leaked fragments of Project Eclipse to trusted colleagues in independent observatories. Not enough to betray national secrets, but enough to spark interest, enough to build a network. He contacted engineers, atmospheric scientists, orbital physicists, those who believed in impossible dreams. Secretly, quietly, they began the simulations. Meanwhile, the alien princess healed, and as her skin mended and her spirit steadied, she began to touch the walls of her chamber, to hum, at first tuneless, then with fragments of melody Elias swore he remembered from ancient lullabies. Her voice was low and resonant, not quite sound, not quite vibration, but Elias recorded it nonetheless, believing it might be the most beautiful thing Earth had ever received from the stars. Still, her body remained fragile. Even artificial light threatened her stability if miscalibrated by a fraction. Elias adjusted everything: wavelengths, moisture levels, ionization. He burned through grant money and Black Ops funding alike. Every tweak bought her another minute of comfort, another hour of hope, and then came the message, encoded in the rhythmic pulse of her energy field, transmitted into the sensors Elias had hardwired into the room. A sentence, disjointed but clear. "I remember stars. They are gone." Elias stared at the readout for hours. This was grief, he realized. The alien princess had not only lost a home, but a sky, a history, a people, and he was offering her a basement. That night, Elias activated the first trial lens in orbit. The city below blinked as the skies dimmed, casting the streets in a soft, dusk-like veil. People thought it was an eclipse. They posted selfies. No one realized it had been orchestrated by a man in love with an alien princess who could never stand in the sun. When Elias showed her the footage, she stared at it for a long time. Then, slowly, she stood and walked toward the projection. Her shadow moved across the floor for the first time. No burns, no convulsions, just silence, like reverence. The alien princess placed her hand on the wall and whispered a single word in her own tongue. The room dimmed further in response. Elias didn't know what the word meant, but he knew what it felt like: acceptance. In the control room, Elias marked the day with a new label: first step into the world. He didn't know then how short-lived the peace would be. Forces far above him had begun to stir. Nations wanted control over Project Eclipse. They saw weapons where Elias saw sanctuary. They saw shadows as a means to domination. And worse, some had learned to fear the alien princess, not for what she was, but for what she represented: a future not centered around mankind. But for now, in a dark room filled with simulated starlight, The alien princess breathed without pain, watched the flickering projection of a night city, and smiled. A smile that didn't need translation, that said simply, "Thank you for turning Earth into night." As the weeks passed, Elias's plan evolved from theoretical concept to tangible reality, each adjustment to the orbital lenses pulling him further from the man he once was, rational, steady, unaffected. His entire existence had shifted. It wasn't just about saving the alien princess anymore. It was about reshaping the world around her, turning Earth into something she could live in without fear. The first test of Project Eclipse had been a success, small but monumental. The city had briefly plunged into twilight, and for the first time, the alien princess Lura stood without pain. Her glowing skin had absorbed the modified light without blistering, her body responding to the darkened atmosphere with a tranquility Elias hadn't dared hope for. That night he watched her touch the floor, her fingers grazing the projection of the dimmed city. The silence between them was suffocating in its weight, but there was something more in the air now, an unspoken understanding that no words could convey. He wasn't just saving her, he was becoming part of her world. In the days that followed, Elias made adjustments, fine-tuning the satellite array that would blanket Earth with controlled shadows. Each experiment required immense precision. A fraction too much exposure to sunlight would send Lura into convulsions, but Elias had studied her every movement, every subtle change in her breathing, and soon he could predict her needs before they became a threat. Still, the burden of it all was crushing. His every action carried the weight of global scrutiny. Governments had their eyes on him, not for his brilliance, but for what he was doing with that brilliance. At first, they had applauded the technological marvel, but as the scope of his plan became clear, their tone shifted. The news broke out. Small, scattered reports trickled into the media, whispers of an extraordinary alien being hidden beneath the surface of the Earth, and the brilliant engineer who was attempting the impossible. What they didn't know was the lengths Elias was willing to go to protect Lura. The cost was staggering. The satellites that powered Project Eclipse were not cheap, and their operation required a network of underground facilities that demanded constant energy. Elias was running out of time and resources. He knew it wouldn't be long before someone demanded to take control, to redirect his project for purposes other than what it was meant for. Humanity's fear of the unknown was too great to ignore. Lura, too, felt the pressure mounting. As Elias worked tirelessly, she watched him from the shadows of her sanctuary, her large eyes following his every movement, her body still as the night she so desperately needed. In her silence, she was as constant and unyielding as the universe, but there was a deep sadness in her gaze, an ache that lingered even when she was surrounded by the artificial starlight Elias had created just for her. She had no words, only an alien rhythm of gestures that communicated her deepest pain, the loss of her world. Elias understood, even if he couldn't fully comprehend the depth of her grief. He had seen her in moments of utter desolation, trembling with memories of distant stars. It tore at him, knowing that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much darkness he conjured, he couldn't bring back what she had lost. They were both prisoners, her in the silence of her grief, and him in the cage of his own relentless ambition. They existed in different worlds, yet they shared the same isolation, the same unyielding loneliness. One evening, as Elias adjusted the final settings for the first full-scale trial of Project Eclipse, Lura stepped closer to him than she ever had before. Her soft, glowing hand brushed against his arm, tentative yet sure, as if she had to be certain that he wasn't another dream, another fleeting image from the stars she could never touch. Elias stopped what he was doing, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned to her, finding the faintest trace of a smile playing at the edges of her lips. It wasn't much, but it was everything. "Thank you," she whispered, not with words, but with a ripple in the air, a shift in the frequencies of the room that only he could feel. It wasn't just gratitude, it was something deeper, something shared between them that could not be named. In that moment, Elias realized that his work, his obsession with saving her, had transformed into something more, a connection, a bond that no scientific achievement could ever explain. The alien princess, Lura, was no longer just a patient. She was his reason. The world outside, the governments, the corporations, the military, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was that she stood there, her skin glowing in the artificial night, and for the first time in his life, Elias felt he had found his place in the universe. It wasn't with the stars, and it wasn't in the dreams of exploration and discovery he'd once held dear. It was here, in the darkness, beside the alien princess who had brought his life into focus. The first full-scale test of Project Eclipse began late that night. The satellites aligned, their lenses converging on a single point. A quiet hum filled the room as Elias made the final adjustment, watching the live feed on the monitors. The light in the city below dimmed, gently falling into a twilight that stretched far beyond the horizon. The streets below seemed to sigh with relief, as if the earth itself could finally breathe again. Elias turned to Lura, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done it. He had turned the earth into a sanctuary for her, a world where she could live without fear of the sun. But just as the first wave of triumph began to settle in, a warning light blinked on the console. Something wasn't right. He hadn't accounted for the ripple effect. The controlled night had spread farther than anticipated, and cities far beyond his intended range were slipping into darkness, disrupting everything. In the distance, he could hear the first murmurs of alarm rising from the world outside. Panic was setting in. Elias's heart raced. He hadn't expected this, but before he could react, Lura took a step toward him, her body still radiating with the soft, comforting light that had become her signature in the artificial night. Her hand reached for the control panel, her fingers grazing the interface with a delicate touch, as if she knew something he didn't. A faint hum reverberated through the air and the warning lights dimmed. The ripple effect stopped. The darkness held steady. Elias watched in awe as Lura manipulated the system with a precision he had never taught her. She was more than a survivor. She was something else entirely, a force capable of controlling the very thing he had created to save her. With a single motion, Lura adjusted the system to stabilize the night, turning it into a steady, controlled dark that would not disrupt the world. The night was hers now, and the world, both human and alien, had changed forever. As the weeks blurred into months, Elias's initial hope, however fragile, had turned into something deeper, more profound. He had not only reshaped the world for her, he had reshaped himself. The man who had once been driven solely by the thrill of discovery, the relentless pursuit of knowledge, now found his purpose tied to Lura in ways he hadn't anticipated. Every choice he made, every adjustment he engineered to perfect Project Eclipse was not just for survival, it was for her. The artificial night that had once been a temporary measure was now a permanent fixture of the world. The sunlight no longer reached the cities. It no longer poured through windows or bathed the landscape in its unforgiving rays. Humanity had come to accept the darkness, and in a twisted way, Elias had become its architect. Governments that had once feared the global blackout now praised him as the hero who had saved the alien princess. But for Elias, the celebration felt hollow. The truth was that no amount of praise could fill the void growing inside him. Every day he found himself more disconnected from the people he had once known, from the life he had once dreamed of. Lura had become more than just a subject of his experiments. She had become his world. Yet, despite the progress of Project Eclipse, he still couldn't shield her from the loneliness that gnawed at her. She had never spoken to him directly, never used words to communicate, but there were moments when Elias swore he could hear her sadness, not in her eyes, but in the very air around her. When they sat together in the darkened rooms of the underground lab, her silent presence filled the space with a longing that he couldn't shake. She was a being of such grace and beauty, but she carried an ache that neither the darkness nor the brilliance of his work could heal. He'd built the world for her, but he hadn't built her a place to belong. The alien princess, no matter how protected, was still a prisoner of her past, a past that was beyond his reach, beyond his understanding. That night, as Elias adjusted the satellite array once again, a new complication arose. The artificial night was beginning to degrade, the equilibrium he had worked so hard to establish. The delicate balance between darkness and light was faltering. It wasn't enough to keep the world in perpetual shadow anymore. The systems that powered Project Eclipse were failing in ways Elias hadn't anticipated. The satellite lenses, which once aligned perfectly, were beginning to shift. If he didn't fix it soon, the night could begin to unravel. Too much light would spill in, threatening Lura's fragile existence. He had pushed the project beyond its limits, and now the consequences were clear. He needed to act fast, but as Elias rushed to stabilize the array, Lura stood behind him, watching. Her gaze followed his every movement with an intensity that left him unsettled. The alien princess had always been silent, always a passive presence in the room, but now there was something different about her, something far more present. Elias could feel it in the air, a subtle energy that prickled at the back of his neck. She was no longer just the subject of his obsession. She had become something far more powerful. "Lura," he whispered, unable to keep the tremor from his voice. Her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, Elias saw something new in them, something beyond the distant sadness. There was a knowing there, a strength he hadn't seen before. She was no longer a passive observer of his actions, but a participant in the world he had created for her. As he worked furiously to correct the satellite malfunction, Elias felt her presence behind him like an anchor, a force that steadied him even as the world around him teetered on the brink of collapse. It was as if she were guiding him, just as he had once guided her. The thought shook him to his core. Had he underestimated her all this time? Had he, in his desperation to save her, forgotten that she too had power? The hum of the array faltered again, and Elias's heart skipped a beat. Time was running out. But then, without warning, Lura moved toward him. She stepped closer, her glowing skin illuminating the dim room with an ethereal light. Without hesitation, she placed her hand on the control panel, her touch barely grazing the interface, and in that instant, something changed. The flickering stopped. The satellite lenses, once unstable, began to align again, their focus returning to the darkness. Elias stood frozen, staring at her in disbelief. The power to fix the problem, to right the wrong he had created, had never been in his hands. It had been in hers. She didn't need words to command the world around her. Her very presence, her being, was enough to shift the balance. Elias had spent so long trying to control the night, but it was Lura who had always been its master. Her touch had brought the night back into balance, and for the first time, Elias realized that his role in her life was not to save her, but to simply be there, to witness her power, her grace, her beauty. The world outside may have called him the savior, the genius who had turned Earth into a haven for the alien princess, but in the end, it was Lura who had saved them both. As the system stabilized and the artificial night settled over the Earth once more, Elias looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of everything he had learned. She was not a prisoner to the darkness, Nor was she the fragile being he had once thought her to be. She was the light in the dark. She was the night itself. And Elias, for all his brilliance, had simply been the man who had helped her realize it. In that moment, he knew that the earth had not only become her sanctuary, it had become hers to command. She was no longer a survivor of her circumstances. She was the architect of her own fate. And Elias, for all his work, was nothing more than a witness to the awakening of a power far greater than his own. The night had settled into the bones of earth, casting an eternal twilight over the world. Cities were bathed in darkness, a shadow that had once seemed like a temporary fix, but now felt like a permanent fixture. Elias stood at the edge of the massive observatory overlooking the planet, his gaze fixated on the glowing outlines of the artificial moon he had crafted for Lura, the alien princess who had taught him more about power and weakness than he ever could have imagined. He had built a sanctuary for her, a world where daylight could never touch her fragile existence, but in doing so, he had unwittingly built a world where he too had become lost in the darkness. He thought of the many times he had tried to save her from the curse of sunlight, how he had designed the satellites to block the sun's rays, how he had constructed the system that now powered the eternal night. It had all seemed so perfect, but nothing had prepared him for the truth. Lura had never needed saving. Elias had been so focused on the mechanics of survival, so obsessed with his own image as the savior, that he had failed to see the full scope of what she had become. She was more than just a victim of the sun's rays. She was a being of power, an entity who had existed for millennia beyond his understanding, and her true strength lay not in her need for protection, but in her ability to shape the world around her. The events of the last few months had been nothing more than a series of revelations, each one chipping away at the image he had built of himself, of her, and of the world they had created together. And now, as the days stretched into an infinite night, Elias felt something shift deep within him, a realization that the time had come for him to let go, to truly let go of the past, of his misconceptions, and of the idea that he could control everything, especially her. The light, that elusive force, was something beyond his reach, something he had tried to trap, to manipulate. But Lura had taught him that light wasn't something that could be contained. It was something that lived in every part of existence, even in the darkest corners of the universe. She was light even when the world around her was swallowed by night. The first time she had placed her hand on the control panel to stabilize the satellite array, Elias had realized that the world he had tried to shape for her had always been hers to command. The night had always been her ally. But it had been so much more than just a refuge. It had been her domain, her kingdom. And the truth was that the world Elias had created, with all its endless darkness, had been a cage, not a sanctuary. She had never needed his protection. She had never needed his brilliance. She had only needed him to see her, to understand that the darkness was not her prison, but her strength. It was a lesson that had come far too late. Elias turned from the observatory window and walked back into the lab, his steps slow and heavy, as if the weight of his realizations had finally caught up with him. Lura stood there, waiting. She didn't speak, didn't move, but her presence was enough to fill the room. She looked at him, and for the first time, Elias felt the full weight of her gaze. She wasn't just a princess, a creature from another world. She was a force, a being beyond his comprehension, and all his efforts to control her, to shape the world for her, had been in vain. He had never understood her. He had never truly understood what it meant to live in the night. He had assumed that by shutting out the sun, by creating a world of endless darkness, he could protect her. But he had only trapped her in a prison of his own making. The satellites that once powered the eternal night were now useless, their purpose fulfilled. They had served their function, but they could do nothing more. The world had shifted, and so had Lura. She didn't need him anymore. She was ready to reclaim her place in the universe, to take her rightful place as the ruler of her own fate. She had never needed saving, never needed protection. All she had needed was someone who could see her for who she truly was. The truth was, Elias had been her companion, her ally, but in the end, it was she who had saved him. She had taught him that the world could not be controlled, that darkness and light were not opposing forces, but part of a greater whole. He had been blinded by his need to fix things, to save her, but in doing so he had lost sight of what was important, the freedom to exist as one truly was. Lura stepped forward, her glowing skin casting a soft light in the dim room. She was no longer the fragile alien princess that Elias had once thought her to be. She was a being of unimaginable power, a force of nature that no human could ever hope to understand. And for the first time, Elias understood his role in her life, not as a savior, but as a witness. He had been the one to help her find her way, but the journey had always been hers to make. As she moved toward him, Elias felt the pull of her presence, a gravity that drew him closer, not as a man to a woman, but as one soul to another. She had lived for so long, and he had only just begun to understand her. She didn't need his protection anymore. She needed his respect. She needed his trust. And for the first time, Elias knew that he could give that to her. The world he had created, this endless night, was no longer a cage, but a blank canvas, a space where she could truly be herself. He had given her the world, but it was she who would shape it. It was she who would lead. And Elias, for all his mistakes, could accept that. As the first rays of the artificial moonlight fell across the room, Elias knew that the time had come to step aside. The night would no longer be his to control. It was hers. And the earth, bathed in eternal darkness, was hers to command. The universe had not been changed by his hands, but by hers. And in the quiet stillness of the lab, Elias could finally accept that the alien princess had never needed him to create the night. She had only needed him to believe in her ability to shape it. He was not the architect of her world. She was. And with that realization, Elias stepped back into the shadows, no longer a savior, but a witness to the awakening of a power far greater than his own. The night was no longer his to control. It was hers. And in that moment, Elias knew that the world had found its true ruler, not him, but her.